In this video, I want to show you the proof that the mainstream history of the Khmer Empire gives us a very distorted version of what actually happened. The reason for such a misleading way to present history is to create the false impression that first of all we live in a civilization which evolves for the better, and the second false impression that they aim to create is that the driving force which caused the demise of the Khmer Empire was simply a byproduct of this alleged progress. They want us to believe that newer, more progressive social structures by themselves replace the older, outdated structures.
The truth is that just a couple of 100 years ago, there still lived people who were fully aware of the older, advanced civilizations on Earth. They kept clear written records about those civilizations, and still to some extent abided by the universal laws of goodness which they inherited from those civilizations. And that is why they had a society which surpassed ours in terms of prosperity, art, culture, management of natural resources, and much, much more.
And the Khmer Empire was just one of the branches of this worldwide culture. And the demise of the Khmer Empire was brought about by the parasitic forces which have embarked on destroying everything beautiful on earth and plunging the human race to the bottom of ignorance and misery. And something else very interesting about the Khmer megaliths, they show evidence that the polygonal stonework, which is often attributed to a lost, very ancient civilization, was still widely used a couple of 100 years ago, and exactly in the Khmer megaliths we will see how did it devolve into brickwork. Now let me show you the evidence for all this and much more. Angkor Wat. The mass media and even some so-called history books assure us that in year 1859 Henry Mohot discovered this amazing city that was lost in the jungle, and they even assure us that even the locals didn't know about it, which is not even mainstream history. Just one of the numerous earlier mentions of Angkor Wat is this Japanese map. There was even a Japanese settlement at that time in Angkor Wat, and that is year 1635. Japanese inscriptions found on the walls of Angkor Wat further confirm this.
The people who built the temple complex, commonly known as Angkor Wat, belonged to the Vedic society. It's a sure bet that if you encountered them now, you would call them Hindus. And since, in one of the previous episodes, we saw how the Japanese, for all practical purposes, are Hindus themselves, their close ties with Angkor Wat isn't surprising at all.
In a couple of the rooms of the main temple in Angkor Wat, still some of the original wooden work, some doors are preserved. The floor here is modern, but the doors are original. So if the complex was indeed built some 1000 years ago, how come this wood didn't rot in this moist and hot tropical environment? If it was indeed left unattended for centuries, as they are telling us, it would have rotten. The bugs would have eaten it a long time ago.
Here, the original wooden elements can be clearly distinguished from the modern support because of their decoration. Is it possible that these wooden doors were actually made during historic renovations and didn't belong to the original temple? I don't think so, because although there were minor traces that here and there the Hindu temples were later reused as Buddhist temples, it was clearly visible that they were refashioned without that fineness, that refinement that the original builders of the temples displayed. And it is out of the question that they could have rebuilt such doors with such elaborate carvings. The carved doors are most definitely original, and they show that Angkor Wat is not as old as they're telling us. As you can see, the doors are not found in some deeply hidden, protected place. They are very close to the outside environment, which is very moist and very hot.
ध्यान दीपाया गंगाधराय गुरुदेवाय लिंगराजाय.
The way in which some of the Khmer temples, actually only a couple of them, are overgrown with these trees certainly creates a very mystical atmosphere. But being mystical should not be confused with being very old, because an actual critical study of the situation with the overgrowing with these trees also shows an evidence that the full complex was not abandoned a long time ago, as they are trying to convince us, but in much more recent times. This spectacular species of trees, it's a couple of varieties of them, similar but not the same, they have an unusual lifespan of 100 years. Sometimes they could live to up to 200 years. If this complex of temples scattered around the jungle over a very large area of tens of kilometers, if this was abandoned for many centuries, there should have been many generations of such huge trees which lived and died, and their trunks remain dry. I visited Angkor Wat earlier this year, and this is not at all what is to be observed. Actually, only a couple of the numerous temples are overgrown with such spectacular trees. The fact that, let's say, 80% of these temples are unaffected speaks for itself. And again, as I said, they are scattered here and there in the jungle. They are not clustered at one place, which is kind of protected from seeds from such trees. No, this is not at all the case. So there is no question of lack of seeds. It's not that the big trees are missing because they were all removed during restoration. They can't be removed so easily because the roots grow in between the stones. And for removing them, one would need to first dismantle the full building. So it's not that a couple of decades ago there were much more trees and now they are simply cleaned up. No, there is no claim that this is the case, and it can't be the case. The number of the trees is one thing, but also their size. There are very few spectacular huge trees, while small trees with small diameter are by hundreds in these couple of overgrown temples. So this also shows that the place was abandoned relatively in recent historic times. Otherwise, we would find around the numerous dried trunks of huge trees. Notice here, all the trees are small, really big, spectacular trees are very, very rare. Also, in recent years, articles started appearing in the media that it's urgent, the trees started destroying Angkor Wat in an alarming rate. Wow, so they were not doing it for the fantasy hundreds of years that it was abandoned, and now that we take care of it and we clean it, they started destroying it at an alarming rate. How come? So the historians, mainstream historians, understand that this makes their stories very shaky. They are fantasy stories that everything is very old and lost, forgotten civilizations from long time ago. That's why they write sheer nonsense, like they say things like the trees that before were supporting Angkor Wat are now destroying it. How come before they were supporting it? Well, the way they explain it is what I told you earlier, that the branches are in between the stones and kind of serve as a mesh between the stones. So what? Now with the alarming rate, they no longer serve as a mesh as they were doing for hundreds of years, and now they became killers of the temples? No, not at all. The truth is that we can't even properly maintain them. Not so long time ago, people used them, people maintained them properly and took good care of them because they were the abodes of their gods. And why do they pay the mainstream historians to confuse people that the culture of Angkor Wat was obliterated in faraway times and not very recently? Because that will reveal the true colors of certain modern governments which operate under the mask of being humane, while in reality they destroy peaceful societies and trash them completely. Those on the top don't do the dirty work themselves. They need fools like us to do the dirty work, fools who believe that waging wars can be justified. Here, even as recent as the age of photography, we see the real Khmer people dressed as the characters on the carvings of the old temples. So obviously they belong to the same culture still. They maintain their temples. Before the previously mentioned fools, that means me and you, came and poisoned their lives with stupid ideology. And of course, everywhere the same pattern. France adopting Cambodia as a protectorate. Look at the words adopting. That means like care, like as if you adopt a child. Then another very misleading term, protectorate, again comes from protection. Really, did they have any protection intent in their mind by invading Siam, murdering the locals to take control of the ruins? And now, in modern times, we, the arrogant fools, we are free to visit Cambodia and feel very good about ourselves by giving few cents to the people we have handicapped in the name of goodness and progress and spreading democracy around the world. And how wonderful that the people who will accept few cents from us equally believe all those lies about progress, and that's why they want to send their kids to a modern school, thus securing a complete wipeout of their memory. of the times when the Khmer people were related to their gods and built complex of monuments which is far bigger than all the famous Egyptian pyramids taken together, not to mention how much superior are the Khmer temples in terms of the elaborate art. So a local guide was showing me some writing on the temples, and he was explaining that this is in a language that they no longer understand at all. He said, now we have a completely new language. I asked him, when did this radically new language appear?
In the 20th century, I think. Between 19th to 20th century, Khmer modern language created.
By whom?
By Chunat. By one monk named Chunat, the monk. Khmer modern language created. Maybe in 20th century.
And this seems to be the standard procedure. Once the parasitic paradigm engulfs a culture of goodness, one way to suffocate it is, as he says, to create a new language by one man, he says. So, one man is paid to create a new language, which is later forced onto the population by the government. That is a very effective way to disconnect the people from the sources of the old knowledge. Even if they manage to get a hold of some old book that has escaped destruction, they won't be able to understand what it says due to linguistic problems. This tactic wasn't adopted only in faraway, exotic places, but also, as we will see in future episodes, in Europe as well.
So after seeing with my own eyes the sheer size of the largest complex of temples on earth, along with the level of craftsmanship of the countless temples and gardens, I left with many questions which remain unanswered till date. First of all, let's see how was everything built. Most of it indeed seems to be simple manual work. The chisel marks are clearly visible, and maybe we could say that this is the situation with most of the stones. It's not hard to study them. One can find them in abundance all over the place. But yet other stones definitely don't make sense in that context. Just look at this stone. It's got chisel marks, but then on the left side it looks as some sort of cast concrete. Now the academic explanation for this is that the stone was originally shaped with chisels, and then they started rubbing it like crazy against another stone until both of them became perfectly smooth to fit each other. Here are some examples of how well they can fit. Now, if somebody would be kind enough to provide a practical demonstration of something like this, I could be inclined to believe that by such a technique, precision has been achieved for fitting this type of stones when we have two perfectly flat surfaces facing each other. Maybe that could be achieved by the technique described, namely endless rubbing until you fall unconscious. But as far as this type of stones, I can't wrap my mind around how this type of surfaces could be a result of rubbing. After all, the lines continue from one stone to the other. Of course, such internal smooth surfaces of the stones could be achieved by other means. which do not require sophisticated technology. But then the question is, why would they make their life so difficult? That would be a titanic amount of work on which millions of men, yes, millions of men, would need to work full-time. I'm talking only about smoothing the inside surfaces of the stones, which are not even visible on the outside. And the question is not only would they, also did they, because obviously they knew about smarter way of building, like for example casting. They were casting each and every individual brick. As you can see, their bricks, at least in the initial stages when they started working with the bricks, when it was still a transition from megaliths to bricks, their bricks were not of standard size. What I'm getting at is that if they knew how to cast bricks, polygonal bricks, probably on the spot, then why wouldn't they do that with the bigger stones? Here you can see each and every brick has got its original unique shape, which perfectly matches not only the neighboring bricks, but it also forms columns, and shortly we'll see they also made statues, sculptures out of them. Now please have a careful look at this particular brick. What is this strange line in the middle? Were they about to make two bricks and then change their mind in the middle of the operation? And how do you make two bricks out of one anyway? By drawing lines? That's pretty interesting. Although I have no clue what was going on with this brick, what I can tell you for sure is that there are similar megalithic stones in Peru, in Turkey, some of them half glued, like parts of each other, or parts of the full wall is like this, half glued, not sure are these different stones or what. And this is not just a small curious detail. The same is the situation with the absolutely huge megalithic blocks of the elf castles. At places they are also a little bit connected. How does that work? Hopefully I can find out during one of the upcoming expeditions, because I see this as a key point which needs to be understood if we want to figure out how did they manage to make at least the older, most impressive megaliths. And there are a couple of more points which kind of make me inclined to think that chiseling stone was used along with casting or some sort of softening on the stone. Both techniques were probably used alongside each other. First of all, at a couple of spots, and that was at spots where the quality of the masonry work was at its highest, I noticed kind of pieces of brick inside the stone. There weren't that many of them, but still, that could be some sort of supporting evidence. This is a huge original stone, but here it's a bit interesting. The top layer somewhat different from the rest. So here it blends well, but here not so well. Now let's get back to this particular image and have another look at the edge of the stone. It kind of leaves the impression that it was soft and then it hardened here on the spot. And again, this is at a spot where the megalithic blocks fit with each other with absolute precision, and not at places where chisel marks are visible and the fitting is not that precise. So that again makes me inclined to believe that the technique of casting or softening was used along with chiseling. Another small clue, these holes on the pyramid, they really don't look chiseled out. They look as if they have been left when the stone was in a softened state. Now and then the art on the walls, rarely, not always, but kind of left the impression that it was kind of pressed in with something sharp when the stone was soft. And now in detail about this very interesting transition from polygonal megaliths all the way to standard bricks at the end. Before the bricks became standard size, they were like this, each and every brick of unique size. I still have no clue how did they project the image onto the wall. Here the nose brick blends so well. What is particularly informative is that we can see the gradual devolution, like this is between bricks and stones. Again, polygonal, because each piece is of unique shape, although not very well pronounced, but still it is. Here also we are on the border between polygonal bricks and polygonal stones. Here again, we are in the gray area between bricks and stones. It looks like bricks because they look small on the photograph, but if you compare them with the people, these are actually brick stones. So here we have some stone art, which is actually cement art, but you wouldn't even guess if it wasn't fallen apart partially and the bricks wouldn't have been exposed. Which is again another proof that they knew how to make cement or geopolymer which looks like stone. Here again, would you call these bricks or stones? They're just in between. At places where the cement batch was well mixed, it still looks very good. But at other places where they used mixture of less strength, the naked truth about the stone sculptures is exposed.
There are many proofs that the Khmer megalith building was not just local, but was part of the worldwide building technique. The proofs of that are endless, like the extensive use of clamps and the polygonal shape of the blocks, obviously. The approach that they used also matches that of Egypt, Peru, and so on. First, they would make a hill of stones, an extremely large one, and then they would carve everything out of it. Do you see this line? First the stones were placed, and then the line was cut. Because it curves, and that curvature passes through a couple of stones. Here's another illustration. Here the chisel marks cross the gaps between the stones. They continue on to neighboring stones.
And these were the same people building this type of structures all over the world. That's why in Egypt, in Turkey, in St. Petersburg, we see the same thing. Long lines cut through multiple stones. That's because they always use the same technique. First place all the stones and then do all the carving or shaping of entire rooms. Doors, windows, balconies, etc. Yeah, that's exactly how they did it. That is the mainstream version, and this is exactly what I saw, but only on the temples of the older generation, when people still had the knowledge how to deal with such a gigantic proportions. Later on, as the devolution to the brick era occurred, various elements were cast and placed next to the bricks, like doors, ornamental windows, borders, columns, etc. And this culture was devolving worldwide as the consciousness of the people was getting lowered. The structures they were building became gradually flimsier and flimsier, but still there was a unique technique used all over the world. Like these are examples from Europe of the same things. Figures cast out of cement on the top of the bricks. Even at that point, we had very successful stone imitations. And as we slide further on the timeline and we get near to the current moment of our glorious history, I think now we are about at the level of the langur monkeys, and in a couple of decades we'll be as smart as the macaques. Just see how durable and beautiful is our restoration work. This is Angkor Wat again. Your radio now or the TV set, immediately somebody will start screaming very loud about cutting edge technologies. So how come people with blunt edges only and allegedly 1000 years ago made bricks that still last, while our bricks left outside on the weather fall apart in a decade, if not much less? Why such lack of correlation between the cutting-edge technologies and the benefits derived from it for the common people? Indeed, we have some access to cutting-edge technologies, but they're given to us only in a small amount, enough to entice us to live the beautiful life in houses amongst nature, so that we can get trapped in cities where we lose our freedom because we can no longer grow clean food, or if needed, they can cut access to any food, depending on how it plays out. But at the end,
the cutting-edge technologies all boil down to a simple process: convincing the people to manufacture and install themselves various devices and substances and other subtle means, all designed to connect the human consciousness to a central hub which would be capable of remotely controlling all those who had voluntarily agreed to become part of that network. So that's why the common people get little or no benefit of the really cutting-edge technologies.
They assume and expect that the technologies will improve their lives, as suggested by the Hollywood movies, but in reality the technologies are introduced for an entirely different purpose. Now the sheer scale of the construction in the Khmer Empire by itself makes it clear that we don't really understand much of what has been going on there. Look at the legend here. Some of the temples spread over many square kilometers. The building with the main altar in the middle would be the size of a hill itself, and then a couple of layers of walls, all of them covered with elaborate carvings. Even the forests around that are full of art and sculptures and shrines and altars and more walls with carved stone. And on the top of that, the moats. This is a very modest one. The bigger ones simply reach to the horizon. And we are told that it has been all handmade by the hard-working Cambodians. I don't believe this one. Like looking at this historic population of Cambodia, just imagine they're implying that in the times of the Khmer Empire it was just a couple of thousand people. And they dug out all those lakes, built the stone mountains, covered them with jewelry quality carvings, and still had so much spare time that they even polished all the blocks of the stone hills inside. Well, that's of course laughable, but the situation with the artificially made canals and bodies of water is quite serious, because they are not local to the area of Angkor Wat. They spread all through the vast Khmer Empire, because Angkor Wat is just one of the centers, and there are endless other temples with more square kilometers of stone hills and thousands of elaborate carvings and murals and art and more temples, and these networks of very wide and amazingly straight canals spreads even outside the Khmer Empire. This is an example of one such canal, of course, used till nowadays, average width 60 meters. This is just an example of this network of canals. The yellow segment is 45 kilometers long, perfectly straight, very deep, as if made for ships. And it goes all the way to Vietnam and the neighboring countries and beyond. Officially, it is, of course, all built by the primitive farmers by hand to water their fields. But in reality, what the farmers have the capacity to build and are building till nowadays are just short, irregular segments which connect their fields to the canals which we have inherited. This is what farmers typically do. It's perfectly within their capacity, and for the bigger canals, which are very deep, suspiciously wide, perfectly straight for dozens of kilometers, for that you need not farmers but engineers to measure it so precisely, and then you need very serious equipment to carry out the enormous digging work. As usual, all the soil that has been taken out from the bigger canals is also nowhere to be found. And it doesn't end here. This network of canals is also interwoven with the network of lifelines, which definitely encompasses the full Earth. Here on this image, I see that they have given a very interesting name to one of the minor canals. They call it Siem Reap River. Very original name. For example, one could name one's cat the Siem Reap Squirrel, and then hope that the people around won't notice that he's actually a cat. Here you can compare a modern town on the right, Ta Seng, with just a single temple complex from the time when people were still great. Compare not only the size, but also the precision, the orderly manner in which the old stuff has been built. And by the way, we've been discussing only building all this stuff, but this is just the beginning of everything. These are Vedic temples, and what that means we can find out by making parallels with the functional Vedic temples in India. I've spent time in such a temple, and I can assure you that it needs hundreds of Brahmins, priests, for maintenance, because all these deities, they require regular offerings many times a day. It is a must, it's not optional. And that requires lots of resources, not just in terms of labor, but also the offerings of ghee, which is purified butter, lots of milk, yogurt, flowers in very large quantities. I can't even imagine how beautiful these large gardens were when the temples were in their prime time. This must have been such a rich and prosperous culture. Amazing. And do you see the shiny metal, cheap jewelry and paraphernalia this girl is using? Well, in the older times, all this was gold. And not like our gold, but pure gold. All of it without exception. And I'm not guessing, I can tell you for sure, because I know from experience in India, over there, till date, every middle class family, if you see them, you will think they are poor, but each and every of them has somewhere, buried in the garden, minimum 4 kilograms of pure gold. When they get their daughters married, they give a full jewelry set top to bottom with heavy jewelry, everything pure gold, otherwise nobody will take the girl. And this is nowadays when the British have successfully planted and harvested the seeds of poison and destruction, which obliterated almost everything good and holy in India. The fact that the British destroyed highly prosperous Vedic kingdoms when they arrived in India is not denied by mainstream history. It is simply skipped by it. That's why most people are not aware of it.
Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya.
And as if the situation with the massive network of canals and lifelines wasn't perplexing enough, here they see with some special technology a structure which looks like some sort of piece of modern technology, but it's actually underground, 1.5 kilometers long. I don't understand the image very well, but if these are ponds, then definitely the installation below ground and the ponds are somehow connected. If this underground, very technical looking installation was on ground, the penguins would have concluded with great certainty that this is a maze for the concubines of the king to play in. But since it is buried, they play another card. Oh, it's a mystery. My personal conclusion out of all this is that we're quite far from understanding much about who the Khmers were.
Rudrakshaya Sarvacharya Sarveshwaraya.
Based on the ruins that I saw, I would say that the lord of the Khmers was Shiva. Although there are deities and depictions of all the other Vedic gods, definitely the Shiva lingas or the deities of Shiva outnumbered them for sure. Now, out of all the highly questionable stories with which the penguins clog our heads, particularly distasteful I find their wild fantasies about the spirituality of the Khmers. So what they say is, this King Suryavarman must have, that's how all wild fantasies began, must have built all this because of fear from this and that, or because he wanted to show off and brag, or because he wanted to prove himself as this or that. How sly on the part of the penguins to use this impressive splendor of Angkor Wat, this awe which it inspires in those who see it, to endorse sick ideas, poison people's minds by subtly and cunningly endorsing that all rulers are low-quality people like the ones we have nowadays. Although in reality, I don't know who and when built these amazing complexes of temples. Doesn't it make much more sense to suggest that if they were self-centered and vain, they would build harems and palaces for their own use instead of fashioning all these stone wonders for the gods, because that's what the temples are. They are abodes of the gods. Why don't they ever say these temples might have been built by a righteous king who cared for his subjects, and that's why he built this paradise? There is also history in the Vedic literature. There were lots of righteous and really noble Vedic kings. That's when the Vedic system was actually functional, not like nowadays in India, where we have a pale reflection, rotten from inside. Shiva, the Lord of the Khmers. Who is he? The truth is that he is an aspect of a personality which is far beyond our scope of understanding. Exactly like this small insect, for example. It's got nervous system, some sort of understanding of the environment, of the other creatures around. It definitely feels and understands things to a certain extent, but does it mean that it can feel or understand the complexities of the human life the way we understand them? No. It can never do that, because it doesn't have a body which is geared for such a purpose. If the soul of this insect gets born in a human body, then it will be able to understand them. And in the same way, since Shiva is an aspect of the supreme all-pervading consciousness, some people call that consciousness God, for example, or the supreme God, we can't comprehend that level of consciousness with our current human body. And that's why the definitions of Shiva which we may attempt to give may end up being very limited and partial. But yet, on the other hand, we can describe very well, with our human capacity, the results from worshipping Shiva. I will describe them using very modern language, because I've noticed that using traditional terms leads to misunderstandings, because such terms often come with preloaded religious coloring. By worshipping Shiva with sincerity, dedication, and clear understanding of what do you want, you will get plugged in, connected to specific cosmic energies which will start flowing into your body. The changes, the physical changes which they will make will be rather slow, but the installation of a new operating system into your psyche will be much faster. This new operating system will not be like the new operating systems that we get for our computers, which are usually worse than the previous versions. The new operating system from Shiva will simply allow you to perceive more subtle levels of reality which were always there, but you didn't have the tools to see them. Hollywood has been brainwashing us since long time that spirituality is about believing in nonsense or things which don't have a separate existence of their own outside the imagination of the believer in them. Millions have bought into this propaganda, and that's why they imagine the spiritual people as irrational, stupid, ungrounded, believing in nonsense. And this is a very modern misunderstanding. In the past, spirituality was exactly for those who understood reality better, who saw more than the others. And this type of blessings were the Khmer people receiving from Shiva, their lord, and that's why they lived in a society far superior to ours. Because perceiving more from the other layers of existence is not something disconnected from anything we call practical in lives. Actually, it is the most practical thing because it can be used in manipulating the events and circumstances within this very limited sphere that most people nowadays call reality. We perceive it as tangible reality. For the Khmer people, it was only the more dense portion of reality.